In the late 17th century, New England was a place of uneasy balance. The land itself was raw, wild, and unforgiving, and those who had come across the ocean to settle it were a people defined by their rigid beliefs and constant fear of moral decay. The Puritans, as they were called, had left England not only to escape religious persecution, but also to build a society they believed would be a shining example of godly order in a fallen world. They saw themselves as chosen, a people given the task of creating a community that reflected the will of God more perfectly than the old world ever had. But with this belief came a burden. Any sign of corruption, any evidence of sin, was not simply a personal failing. It was a threat to the entire covenant between the community and their God. If the people strayed, if sin was allowed to take root, then divine punishment might fall on everyone. This worldview was the soil in which suspicion and fear could easily grow. The Puritan way of life was strict to the point of suffocation. They rejected anything that smelled of excess or frivolity, seeing pleasure as a dangerous distraction from godly living. The Sabbath was enforced with relentless seriousness. Work was seen as a duty, leisure as a risk, and individuality as a potential rebellion. This was not a world that valued personal freedom in the modern sense. It was a world where conformity was survival, where the individual was bound tightly to the collective, and where deviation was not just frowned upon, but feared as evidence of the devil's subtle work. Children were raised under heavy discipline, expected to memorize scripture and obey without question. Women lived under male authority, expected to serve husbands, maintain households, and raise children with piety. Men carried the responsibility of spiritual leadership, and the ministers who guided them were often the most powerful voices in town. Yet beneath this outward display of rigid order was a constant undercurrent of anxiety. The Puritans believed in a universe alive with spiritual forces. To them, the devil was not a metaphor. He was a literal being whose hand could be felt in misfortune, illness, crop failure, and unexplained events. Every cough that lingered too long, every animal that sickened without cause, every failed harvest could be read as a sign of supernatural interference. In a world where science had not yet offered explanations for disease or natural disasters, the devil was the ever-present answer. If God was the force of order, then Satan was the force of chaos. And he was always waiting for a chance to undermine the community. This belief was reinforced by their history. Many of the settlers in New England had lived through turbulent times in Europe, where witchcraft had been prosecuted for generations. They brought with them stories of witches who made pacts with the devil, who cursed neighbors, who caused storms, and who worked unseen mischief. While Europe's witch trials had reached their height in the preceding century, the memory of them was still fresh. And in the minds of the Puritans, the wilderness of New England itself seemed to confirm these fears. The dense forests, stretching endlessly beyond the edge of their cleared fields, were seen as both physically dangerous and spiritually threatening. This was the home of native peoples whom the Puritans did not understand and often demonized. It was a place untamed, where the devil could easily hide. Daily life was harsh, and this harshness only deepened the sense of vulnerability. Death was a constant companion. Children died young, women frequently died in childbirth, and epidemics could wipe out entire families. In a society that viewed every misfortune as a possible sign of God's judgment, grief was never just grief. It was often accompanied by questions of who had sinned, who had opened the door to evil, who was responsible for the suffering. And when those questions could not be answered clearly, suspicion often turned outward. Someone had to be blamed, And in a world saturated with belief in the devil's power, witches were the most convenient explanation. It is important to see how all of this created an environment of constant tension. The Puritans were trying to build what they saw as a city upon a hill, but every shadow, every failure, every deviation from the rules of their faith seemed like proof that Satan was working in their midst. Ministers warned their congregations that the devil prowled at the edges of their community, whispering in ears, tempting the weak, and turning neighbors against one another. The sermons thundered with warnings about eternal damnation and the punishments that awaited the sinful. To live in such a world was to live always on the edge of fear, never quite sure if you or someone close to you might be slipping into the devil's grasp. Salem itself was not a single unified town, but a place already divided. Salem town, located on the coast, was wealthier, more connected to trade, and looked outward toward the world. Salem village, just a few miles inland, was poorer, more insular, and defined by resentment of its more prosperous neighbor. This division was not just geographical, but spiritual. Salem village was filled with people who believed the outside world was corrupt, who clung even more tightly to their vision of a godly community. Disputes over land, church leadership, and political authority simmered constantly. These local conflicts laid the groundwork for suspicion to take root in a particularly volatile way. Into this setting came the year 1692, remembered now as the beginning of the Salem witch trials. But to understand how accusations of witchcraft could explode into mass hysteria, one must first understand the fear that lived just beneath the surface of daily life. The Puritans were primed for it. They believed they were at war, not only with the natural challenges of survival in a harsh land, but with the supernatural forces of darkness. They believed they were a chosen people, but that very belief meant they lived with the constant terror of losing God's favor. The devil was real, witches were his servants, and the safety of the community depended on rooting them out. What happened in Salem did not come from nowhere. It was the result of years of tension, fear, and division, combined with a religious worldview that saw no separation between the physical and the spiritual. When the first strange fits began among the children of Salem village, they did not appear in a vacuum. They appeared in a community already haunted by the suspicion that evil was lurking close by, waiting to strike. And when the accusations began, they spread with the speed of fire through dry grass, because everyone was already looking for signs of the devil's hand. The seeds had been planted long before. The sermons, the hardships, the divisions, and the constant vigilance against Satan's supposed plots had prepared the people of Salem for what was to come. When the spark finally landed, it ignited a fear that could not easily be contained. To follow the story forward is to watch how those fears turned neighbor against neighbor, how invisible evidence was given weight in court, how confession and denial alike could lead to death, and how an entire community was consumed by hysteria in the name of protecting itself from an enemy it could not see. The people who crossed the Atlantic in the 17th century did not arrive as blank slates. They carried with them the entire weight of Europe's history, its wars, its religious divisions, and its deep fears about the forces of darkness. When the Puritans stepped onto the rocky shores of Massachusetts, they were not entering an untouched world. They were transplanting a culture already scarred by centuries of conflict and suspicion, a culture that had fought bitter wars over faith, and had seen thousands of people accused, tortured, and executed for witchcraft. What would happen in Salem was not an isolated eruption of madness, but part of a much older pattern, shaped by ideas that had taken root long before the New England colonies even existed. Europe in the late Middle Ages and early modern period had been obsessed with the figure of the witch. The church taught that witches were not just heretics, but active servants of Satan, dangerous enemies who conspired against Christendom. In reality, many accusations of witchcraft had less to do with pacts with the devil and more to do with local quarrels, unexplained illnesses, or suspicions directed toward women who did not fit neatly into the expectations of their community. A widow who lived alone, a midwife whose knowledge of herbs seemed uncanny, a beggar who cursed when denied charity, all could become targets in an atmosphere where misfortune demanded an explanation and the devil's presence was assumed. Between the 15th and 17th centuries, tens of thousands of people across Europe were executed for witchcraft. The trials were often brutal, relying on confessions extracted under torture, spectral evidence of dreams and visions, or testimony twisted by fear. While many of these trials occurred in Germany, Switzerland, and France, England itself was not immune. During the rule of James I, witch hunting was encouraged, and pamphlets describing supposed cases of possession and sorcery circulated widely. The infamous Matthew Hopkins, self-styled Witchfinder General, gained notoriety in the mid-17th century for sending dozens of people to the gallows in East Anglia. The Puritans who eventually settled in Massachusetts would have been well aware of these stories, and some had lived through the witch panics of the old country themselves. Religious conflict made the atmosphere even more charged. The Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation had torn Europe apart. Both sides accused the other of corruption and of serving the devil. This climate of suspicion extended naturally to fears of witches, who were believed to embody rebellion against God's order. For the Puritans, who had left England in pursuit of what they saw as a purer, holier faith, the struggle against sin and Satan was not theoretical. It was a lived reality, an ongoing battle in which they were soldiers of Christ on hostile ground. The voyage across the Atlantic only deepened this sense of peril. Crossing the ocean in the 17th century was a dangerous undertaking. Ships could be lost to storms, scurvy could kill passengers, and months at sea created a liminal state where those aboard felt cut off from everything familiar. To many, the very act of leaving Europe behind carried echoes of biblical exile, a chosen people cast into the wilderness to test their faith. And when they arrived, the wilderness of New England seemed to confirm every sermon they had heard about spiritual danger. The forests were vast, filled with unknown animals, hostile winters, and indigenous peoples who resisted the encroachment on their lands. For the Puritans, who already associated the untamed wilderness with chaos and with the devil, this new world seemed to embody everything they feared. The native peoples themselves were often described in demonic terms by the settlers, not only because of conflict over land, but because their unfamiliar spiritual practices seemed like evidence of satanic influence. The Puritans saw themselves as God's army on the frontier of a spiritual war. Every crop that failed, every infant that died, every raid that struck their settlements could be interpreted as proof that Satan was pressing in from the wilderness. This mindset left little room for natural explanations or for viewing their new neighbors as anything other than spiritual enemies. At the same time, the settlers carried with them European traditions of folk belief that existed alongside official religion. Many still believed in charms to ward off evil, in omens that foretold misfortune, in the power of dreams to reveal hidden truths. Ministers thundered against these practices as remnants of superstition, yet they remained stubbornly present in daily life. A horseshoe above the door, a strange mark carved into wood, a whispered prayer over livestock, all reflected a worldview where unseen forces constantly interacted with the visible world. In such a society, the idea that a neighbor might curse your cow or cause your child's illness through witchcraft was not far-fetched. It was an extension of beliefs already deeply rooted. What made New England distinct was the intensity of its religious framework. The Puritans had not come merely to escape persecution, but to build what they saw as a holy commonwealth, a model of godly living that would prove to the world that they were the true heirs of the covenant. This ambition demanded vigilance. The fear was not only that witches might lurk among them, but that any failure to root them out would invite God's wrath on the entire community. And they had evidence, or at least what they saw as evidence, that such wrath was real. Epidemics swept through towns, killing young and old alike. Harsh winters froze crops and livestock. Wars with indigenous peoples erupted, leaving settlements destroyed and survivors traumatized. In this environment, the question was not whether Satan was at work, but where he was working, and through whom. By the time the events in Salem began, several cases of witchcraft had already been prosecuted in New England. In 1647, a woman named Alsa Young was executed in Connecticut, the first recorded execution for witchcraft in the colonies. Dozens more would follow in the decades before 1692, including a notorious cluster of trials in Hartford. These earlier cases did not reach the scale of Salem, but they established a precedent. The courts had already shown that accusations of witchcraft could lead to death. Ministers had already preached that witches were real, that they threatened the very survival of the godly community, and that vigilance was the only defense. The Puritans' obsession with covenant theology added yet another layer of pressure. They believed their entire community existed in a binding contract with God. If the people lived righteously, blessings would follow. If they sinned, curses would come. Ministers often interpreted natural disasters, epidemics, and military defeats as signs that the covenant had been broken. This collective guilt meant that one person's hidden sin could bring punishment on all. The search for witches was not simply about individual wrongdoing. It was about protecting the entire community from God's judgment. To ignore signs of witchcraft would be to risk everyone's safety. All of these currents, European witch-hunting traditions, religious wars, folk beliefs, the dangers of the wilderness, the trauma of colonial life, and the weight of covenant theology flowed together in New England. They created a culture primed to see the devil's hand in every misfortune and to believe that witches were active, dangerous, and close at hand. By the time strange fits began in Salem Village, the stage was already set. The people had inherited a worldview haunted by the fears of the old world, and they carried those fears into the new. What erupted in 1692 was not an accident or an anomaly. It was the inevitable collision of European history, Puritan theology, and colonial hardship in a place where the line between the natural and the supernatural had been erased. The world of the Puritans was always a battlefield. To them, the devil was not a distant figure lurking in hell, but a constant presence, whispering temptations, sowing division, and seeking to destroy God's chosen people. When Salem exploded into accusations, trials, and executions, it was this worldview that fueled the fire. They were not inventing new fears. They were reenacting old ones, transplanted from Europe to the edge of the American wilderness, and given new life in a community that believed its survival depended on rooting out every trace of evil. Salem Village was not simply a place on a map. It was a settlement shaped by tension, suspicion, and division, a community that seemed always to teeter on the edge of conflict. By the early 1690s, it had become the perfect breeding ground for unrest. To understand why the witchcraft crisis erupted here and not in some other town, one must look closely at the soil from which it grew. The village lay only a few miles inland from Salem town, but the differences between the two were stark. Salem town was tied to the Atlantic world. Merchants traded goods, ships came and went from its harbour, and wealth flowed through its markets. Salem village, by contrast, was made up largely of small farmers whose lives were consumed by hard work and narrow margins. They looked at the prosperity of the town with both envy and resentment. Some families hoped to benefit from the trade and opportunity that commerce brought, while others wanted nothing to do with what they saw as corruption and worldliness. These conflicting visions of what Salem village should be, whether oriented outward toward the wider world or inward toward a stricter godly life, lay at the heart of many of its troubles. Land disputes further deepened divisions. In a farming community, land was the measure of wealth, power, and legacy. Families quarreled over boundaries, inheritances, and titles. Neighbors accused one another of encroachment. Old grudges simmered just below the surface, and in a world where survival depended on cooperation, these disputes could turn relationships sour for generations. Many of the families who would later appear on opposite sides of the witchcraft accusations were already entrenched in these battles over property. Religion only heightened the conflict. Salem village had long struggled with its church. For years it relied on the ministry of Salem town, but many villagers resented the distance and demanded a church of their own. When they finally achieved this in the 1670s, the new church became a source of turmoil rather than unity. Ministers came and went, some pushed out by factions who disliked their style, others leaving under clouds of discontent. By the time Reverend Samuel Parris was called to lead the church in 1689, the village was already divided over questions of authority and spiritual leadership. Parris himself was not a figure likely to heal such wounds. Born in England and raised in Barbados, he had failed as a merchant before turning to the ministry. His sermons were uncompromising, his manner authoritarian, and his personality marked by both ambition and insecurity. He insisted on loyalty and saw opposition as rebellion against God. To his supporters, he was a strong leader, committed to defending the purity of the faith. To his critics, he was a divisive figure whose rigid style only deepened the village's fractures. When the witchcraft crisis began, Parris's role would be central, both as the minister whose household first showed signs of affliction and as the voice that framed those signs as evidence of Satan's work. Economic inequality widened the gap between neighbors. Some families prospered from ties to Salem town's commerce, while others struggled to scrape by. The Putnams, one of the most powerful clans in Salem village, often clashed with wealthier merchants connected to the town. This rivalry was not abstract. It played out in disputes over church membership, over land purchases, and eventually over accusations of witchcraft. The Putnams would become some of the most zealous accusers, while those tied to Salem town's interests often found themselves targeted. The political climate of Massachusetts added yet another layer of instability. The colony had recently endured the upheaval of the Dominion of New England, a failed attempt by the English crown to consolidate control. The overthrow of the Dominion in 1689 had left governance unsettled. Uncertainty about authority trickled down into local communities, where people argued over who had the right to lead and what laws should be followed. In Salem village, already fractured by disputes over land and religion. This larger uncertainty only sharpened the sense of living on shaky ground. Fear of external threats compounded internal divisions. The frontier was not far away, and war with indigenous peoples was a constant danger. Only a few years earlier, King Philip's War had devastated New England, leaving towns destroyed and settlers traumatized. Refugees fleeing from the main frontier brought with them stories of raids, massacres, and burning homes. These accounts circulated through Salem village, stoking fear and resentment. Many of the young girls who would later become accusers had grown up in the shadow of these horrors, their childhood shaped by tales of bloodshed and loss. The belief that the devil was at work in the wilderness was not an abstract idea. It was reinforced by lived experiences of violence and terror. Daily life in Salem village reflected all of these tensions. Families worked hard in the fields, raised children under strict discipline, and gathered each week in the meeting house for sermons that warned constantly of sin, damnation, and the presence of Satan. Ministers reminded them that the devil sought to corrupt even the most faithful, that he could disguise himself as an angel of light, that he could work through neighbors, friends, even family members. Against this backdrop, gossip carried weight. A whispered suggestion that someone's cow had died under suspicious circumstances, or that a child had fallen ill after a quarrel, could take on the aura of the supernatural. Disputes that might elsewhere have remained personal grievances became framed as evidence of spiritual warfare. Salem village was a tinderbox. The conflicts over land, the rivalries between families, the disputes over religion, the fear of attack from beyond the frontier, and the constant drumbeat of sermons about Satan's power created an atmosphere where trust was fragile and suspicion easy. When young girls in Reverend Parris's household began to show strange symptoms, fits, convulsions, cries of torment, it did not take long for villagers to interpret their behavior through the lens of everything they already feared. They were not simply children behaving strangely. They were signs that the devil had entered their midst. The eruption that followed was not born of hysteria alone. It was born of years of tension, division, and fear in a community that lived perpetually on the edge of crisis. Salem village was ready to believe the worst, and when the moment came, belief turned rapidly into action. The stage was set, the divisions were in place, and the people were primed to see the hand of Satan in the behavior of their neighbors. The winter of 1692 in Salem village was long, bitter, and confining. Families huddled inside their small homes while snow piled up against the walls, and the cold pressed in from every side. It was in this season of isolation that strange behavior began to unfold in the household of Reverend Samuel Parris, the man whose fiery sermons already divided the community. Within the cramped parsonage, where tensions often ran high, two young girls began to exhibit symptoms that no one could easily explain. 9-year-old Betty Parris, the minister's daughter, and her cousin Abigail Williams, who was 11, were the first. They screamed without cause, threw themselves into convulsions, and contorted their bodies in ways that terrified those who watched. Their speech shifted into incoherent babbling, and they claimed to feel pinching, stabbing, and invisible assaults. At times, they barked like animals or tried to fly. Neighbors who came to see them described the scenes with awe and horror, convinced that something unnatural was taking place. In an age without modern medicine, such symptoms could not be explained by epilepsy, mental illness, or other conditions we would recognize today. The Puritans interpreted them through their religious lens. If the girls were tormented, it was not a matter for physicians, but for ministers. The invisible world was believed to press constantly against the visible one, and the devil's power could manifest in the bodies of the innocent. Betty and Abigail's afflictions looked to their neighbors like proof that Satan had entered Salem village. Others soon joined them. Ann Putnam Jr., the 12-year-old daughter of one of the village's most influential families, began to show the same fits. Soon after, several more girls displayed similar symptoms. Among them, Mercy Lewis, Mary Walcott, and Elizabeth Hubbard. They writhed on the floor, shrieked at invisible shapes, and accused unseen forces of tormenting them. The circle of afflicted expanded, and with each new case, the sense of panic grew. This was no longer just a strange illness confined to one household. It looked like an outbreak of diabolical assault, spreading from child to child. The adults around them sought explanations. Physicians were called, among them Dr. William Griggs, who examined the afflicted and found no natural cause. In the language of the time, he declared that the girls were under an evil hand. With that pronouncement, suspicion turned from puzzlement to terror. If the children were bewitched, then someone in the community had made a pact with the devil. The hunt for witches began not in the courts, but in the whispers of the meeting house and the fearful gossip of neighbors. What made the situation even more potent was the age and social status of the afflicted. These were not marginalized women or outsiders whose complaints might be dismissed. They were children of respected families, daughters of landowners, and of the minister himself. Their words carried weight, and their suffering demanded explanation. To ignore them would be to risk ignoring a genuine attack by Satan. In a society where the covenant with God was believed to depend on vigilance against sin, no one could afford to take that risk. The behavior of the children also tapped into older cultural fears. For generations, stories of possession and bewitchment had circulated in Europe, often centered on young women or girls. Their strange symptoms were seen as the devil's way of gaining entry into a community through the vulnerable. Ministers wrote treatises describing how Satan could afflict the innocent as part of his war against the faithful. The people of Salem had inherited these traditions, and when they saw the children collapse into convulsions and scream of torment, they recognized the pattern immediately. What began as disturbing but localized episodes soon spread beyond the parsonage. The afflicted were taken to the meeting house where others could witness their torments. Entire gatherings watched as the girls cried out against invisible shapes, claimed to see specters, and accused those specters of harming them. Each performance confirmed the community's deepest fears, that the devil was working among them, and that he was using familiar faces as his instruments. The presence of the Putnam family in this story added fuel to the fire. The Putnams were among the most powerful clans in Salem village, deeply involved in its disputes over land and leadership. Their daughter Ann Jr. became one of the most vocal accusers, and her parents supported her claims. For the Putnams, the crisis was not only spiritual, but also a chance to press against rivals, whether consciously or unconsciously. The girls' accusations provided an outlet for old grievances, cloaked in the language of spiritual warfare. As more children fell into fits, the pressure mounted on the authorities to act. The afflicted claimed to see specters, shadows or apparitions of specific individuals standing by their beds or attacking them during their seizures. These visions were taken as real evidence in a world where the invisible and the visible were inseparably linked. If the girls saw the specter of a neighbor tormenting them, then that neighbor was surely guilty of witchcraft. Ministers warned that the devil could not use a person's shape without their consent, which meant the accused were, by definition, guilty. The children's cries gave voice to fears already embedded in the community. Salem village had long been haunted by disputes, anxieties, and resentments. Now, those undercurrents surfaced through the mouths of young girls whose claims were taken as pure and untainted by worldly motives. In a society that believed children were closer to innocence, their accusations seemed all the more credible. If they said they were tormented, who could doubt them? The fire was lit in the parsonage of Reverend Paris, but it did not stay contained there. The afflictions spread, the accusations began, and the atmosphere of Salem village shifted from tense to explosive. What had started as mysterious fits in a handful of children became the spark that would ignite one of the most infamous episodes of mass hysteria in American history. The village that had long stood on the edge of conflict was now fully consumed by fear, and the search for witches was about to begin in earnest. The strange behavior of the children quickly became the central obsession of Salem village. Their fits were unlike anything most people had ever witnessed. Witnesses described them collapsing without warning, their limbs twisted into unnatural positions, their bodies rigid one moment and thrashing the next. They screamed that they were being stabbed with invisible knives, pinched by unseen hands, or choked by spectres no one else could see. Their words came in sudden bursts, sometimes shouted, sometimes whispered, often accusing particular people of tormenting them. Neighbours crowded into the parsonage or into the meeting house to watch. What they saw convinced many that natural explanations were impossible. When a girl cried out in pain, others claimed to see a shadowy figure standing by her side. When she pointed across the room, accusing a villager of afflicting her, the crowd turned their eyes on the accused, waiting to see how they would respond. If the accused shifted nervously or denied too quickly, suspicion hardened into certainty. These fits did not occur in isolation. They were accompanied by a growing culture of fear that gave them meaning. For weeks before the accusations began, the village had already been shaken by sermons warning that Satan was among them. Reverend Paris had spoken of invisible snares, of the devil seeking to devour the faithful, of hidden sins that threatened to bring God's wrath on the community. The afflicted children, writhing on the floor and crying out against unseen forces, seemed like living proof of everything he had preached. Some villagers sought practical explanations. They wondered if the children had eaten something spoiled, or if their strange games of fortune-telling, with an egg and a glass of water, known as a Venus glass, had unsettled their minds. Others suggested simple mischief, that the girls were seeking attention or rebelling against strict discipline. But these voices were quickly drowned out. To accuse the minister's daughter and his niece of lying or of play acting was to risk blasphemy. It was safer to believe that the devil was at work than to question the spiritual foundations of the community. The afflicted girl's behavior also escalated in ways that reinforced belief in supernatural causes. They screamed at invisible animals, claiming to see cats, dogs, or birds sent by witches to torment them. They contorted their bodies into postures that seemed inhuman, arching their backs or twisting their necks in ways that frightened even hardened adults. They repeated words spoken softly across the room as if by uncanny hearing, or they fell into sudden silence only to erupt moments later with accusations. Each performance drew more attention, and with each performance, more villagers became convinced that witchcraft was real and present. Spectral evidence became the most frightening element. When a girl declared that she saw the spectre of a neighbour standing over her, stabbing her with an invisible knife, the community believed it. Ministers had long taught that the devil could not assume the shape of an innocent person without permission. Therefore, if the girl saw someone's spectre, that person must have given the devil their consent. In a courtroom, that standard would soon become decisive. For now, in the meeting house, it created a dangerous atmosphere where accusation itself was almost proof. Fear spread beyond the afflicted themselves. Other villagers began to report strange occurrences. Livestock sickened suddenly, food spoiled without explanation, tools broke in unexpected ways. Each mishap was added to the growing catalogue of signs that the devil's servants were active. Dreams and visions gained new significance. A villager who dreamed of a dark figure looming over their bed interpreted it as a witch's attack. Every shadow, every unexplained noise became part of the narrative of unseen forces pressing in on Salem village. The afflicted girls, though young, held immense power in this moment. Their words could shape the fate of adults. Their accusations could ruin reputations. Their fits could draw the entire community into a frenzy. When one girl cried out that she saw the spectre of a villager, others quickly echoed the claim, their voices overlapping, their bodies convulsing in tandem. To onlookers, this was not the behavior of conspirators, but of victims. They believed they were watching the devil torment the innocent through the agency of witches. As winter turned to spring, the pressure on the authorities grew too strong to ignore. The villagers demanded answers. The afflicted demanded relief. The ministers demanded vigilance. And the courts would soon be asked to intervene. But the foundation had already been laid. Strange fits, invisible assaults, and spectral visions had convinced Salem village that something diabolical was at work. Once that belief took hold, it was only a matter of time before names were spoken aloud and accusations turned into formal charges. Once the afflicted children's cries had convinced the village that unseen forces were tormenting them, the question everyone asked was who? If witches were at work, they had to be neighbors, someone close, someone familiar, someone who had chosen to serve the devil. The children's accusations provided the answer, and those names would ignite a storm unlike anything Salem had ever seen. The first to fall under suspicion was not a powerful landowner or a prominent figure, but a woman already on the margins. Tituba, the enslaved woman in the household of Reverend Samuel Parris, became an obvious target. She was of indigenous or possibly Afro-Caribbean origin, brought from Barbados to New England, and her very presence in the parsonage stirred unease. Outsiders, especially those with different customs or backgrounds, were easy to link with witchcraft in a society already primed to fear the strange. The afflicted children claimed they saw her spectre, that she pinched them, choked them, and sent animals to torment them. For the villagers, it seemed to fit. She was foreign, a servant, and defenseless against the accusations of children tied to the minister himself. Alongside Tituba, 2 other women were named. Sarah Good was a destitute beggar who wandered from house to house with her young child, relying on the charity of neighbors and often cursing those who turned her away. In a community that prized order, industry, and obedience, she embodied disorder. Her muttered complaints, her ragged appearance, and her reliance on others marked her as suspicious long before the accusations began. Sarah Osborne, the 3rd woman accused, was different but equally vulnerable. She was a landowner who had defied social expectations by managing property herself and marrying her servant. In Puritan eyes, such behavior suggested rebellion, pride, and sin. She had not attended church regularly, further confirming suspicions that she had drifted from godliness. These 3 women, an enslaved outsider, a beggar, and a defiant landowner, shared little in common, except that they did not fit neatly into the expectations of Salem village. In times of fear, Those on the margins often become scapegoats, and here the pattern held. The afflicted children pointed to them, the villagers whispered agreement, and soon formal complaints were filed. The machinery of accusation began to move. The first examinations took place in March of 1692 at the meeting house in Salem village. Crowds gathered to witness the proceedings, eager to see whether the devil's servants would be exposed. The accused women were brought in one by one, questioned by magistrates, and confronted by the afflicted. The atmosphere was charged with hysteria. When Sarah Good denied the accusations, the girls convulsed violently, claiming her denial only strengthened the devil's hold on them. Every movement she made, every word she spoke, was mirrored by fresh fits. To the onlookers, this seemed undeniable proof. If she were innocent, why would the afflicted suffer more in her presence? Sarah Osborne, weakened by illness, protested her innocence, but could barely stand under the weight of questioning. Her irregular church attendance was cited as evidence of her estrangement from God. To a community that equated piety with safety, her absence from worship became another sign that she had opened herself to Satan's influence. It was Tituba, however, whose examinations set the course for everything that followed. At first, she denied the charges, but under pressure she confessed. Her confession was not simple. She told vivid stories of witches' meetings, of black dogs and red cats, of strange birds and spectral visitations. She claimed there were more witches in Salem, not just herself, and that they had signed the devil's book. Her words electrified the village. A confession meant confirmation, and the suggestion that others remained hidden among them transformed the crisis from a handful of suspicious cases into a full-blown hunt. Why Tituba confessed remains debated. Some believe she did so under threat of violence, seeking to protect herself by giving the magistrates what they wanted. Others argue that, as an enslaved woman with little hope of justice, she may have calculated that confession was safer than denial. Whatever her motives, her testimony poured fuel on the fire. By naming the existence of a broader conspiracy, she shifted Salem's imagination from 3 accused women to a hidden network of witches lurking in plain sight. The effect was immediate. The afflicted children echoed her claims, convulsing and shrieking whenever the accused women were present, confirming in their fits what Tituba had described. The magistrates recorded every detail, and the villagers went home whispering about a conspiracy of witches in their midst. Fear spread like a contagion. If witches could be found among the enslaved, the poor, and the defiant, then they could be found anywhere. No one was beyond suspicion. The examinations ended with all 3 women committed to jail. But the atmosphere of Salem village had changed permanently. What had begun as strange fits in the parsonage was now an official investigation into witchcraft. The court had spoken, the accused were imprisoned, and the community believed the devil's servants were real and active. Yet rather than calming fears, these first accusations opened the floodgates. Once the possibility of a hidden network was raised, every quarrel, every grudge, every unexplained misfortune became a potential sign of witchcraft. More names would be spoken, more neighbors accused, and Salem's descent into hysteria was only beginning. The first examinations and arrests might have been contained had they remained local matters, but Salem village was no longer dealing with private disputes. The crisis had grown too large, too loud, and too dangerous for the colony's leaders to ignore. By the spring of 1692, the jails of Massachusetts were filling with accused witches. Complaints were arriving from beyond Salem itself, spreading into surrounding towns. Ordinary courts were not equipped to handle the volume or the nature of the charges, especially when those charges relied on visions, dreams, and spectral evidence. The colony's fragile leadership, only recently re-established after years of political turmoil, faced immense pressure to act decisively. Governor William Phips, newly appointed and eager to stabilize his administration, authorized a special tribunal to deal with the mounting crisis. It was called the Court of Oyer and Termina, an old legal phrase meaning to hear and determine. The very creation of this court signaled to the people of Massachusetts that the government believed the threat was real and demanded extraordinary measures. Salem's witchcraft panic was no longer just a local drama. It had become a matter of colonial law and order. The court was established in May 1692 and was composed of some of the most prominent men in the colony. At its head sat William Stoughton as Chief Justice, a stern magistrate deeply committed to Puritan orthodoxy. Alongside him were other figures of wealth and standing, men who believed they were defending not only the law, but the very survival of their godly community. They entered the proceedings already convinced that witches were real, that Satan was at work, and that harsh measures were necessary to purge the colony of this hidden threat. The trials were held in Salem town, drawing crowds from miles around. The meeting house was transformed into a courtroom where the accused stood before judges, ministers, and spectators. The atmosphere was charged with fear and fascination. The afflicted girls were brought in to give testimony, and their fits became central evidence. When they screamed, collapsed, or claimed to see spectres, the court treated their behavior as proof. Every convulsion seemed to confirm that the accused were guilty, that Satan himself was present in the room. Spectral evidence became the cornerstone of the court's decisions. According to this reasoning, if an afflicted person claimed to see the spectre of an accused witch tormenting them, that testimony was valid even if no one else could see it. Ministers had long debated whether the devil could assume the shape of an innocent person without consent, but the court largely accepted the strict interpretation that he could not. Therefore, if a spectre appeared, it must have been with the accused's permission, which meant guilt. This reliance on invisible evidence blurred the line between law and theology, turning the court into an arena where the unseen determined life and death. Confessions added another layer of pressure. Those who confessed to witchcraft, whether truthfully or out of desperation, often escaped execution. Those who denied the charges faced harsher outcomes. This dynamic created a perverse incentive. The path to survival was to admit guilt and implicate others. Each confession expanded the circle of suspicion, naming more supposed witches, feeding the court's belief in a vast conspiracy. The result was a snowball effect, where every trial generated new accusations, and every accusation brought more prisoners into the jails. The accused faced nearly impossible odds. Standing alone before a panel of judges, with the eyes of the community upon them and the afflicted girls shrieking in supposed torment, their protests of innocence carried little weight. Legal representation as we know it today did not exist. The accused spoke for themselves, often under the glare of neighbors who had long resented them. Evidence such as old grudges, misfortunes, or eccentric behavior was recast as signs of witchcraft. A muttered curse that coincided with a neighbor's illness became damning. A failed prayer test, stumbling over the Lord's Prayer during examination, was taken as proof of guilt. The first major case before the new court was that of Bridget Bishop, a woman in her 60s known for her outspoken manner and her unconventional lifestyle. She had been accused of witchcraft before, but never convicted. To the court, Her reputation for wearing bright clothing, her frequent quarrels, and her tavern ownership made her a symbol of disorder. The afflicted girls fell into fits at the sight of her, claiming her spectre tormented them. Despite her firm denials, she was quickly found guilty. On June 10, 1692, Bridget Bishop was hanged at Gallows Hill, the first execution of the Salem witch trials. Her death marked a turning point. With blood now spilled, the court's authority was cemented, and the panic intensified. More trials followed, more executions loomed, and the colony braced itself for what seemed like an all-out war against Satan's army. Each new conviction reassured the fearful that justice was being done, but it also raised the stakes. If the devil's servants could be found in Salem, they could be found anywhere. If one woman could be hanged, many more could follow. The court of Oyer and Terminer became the central stage upon which Salem's tragedy played out. It combined the authority of law with the fervor of religion, transforming accusations into convictions, suspicions into executions. The villagers who filled the benches, the ministers who whispered in the judge's ears, the children whose fits convulsed the courtroom, all contributed to an atmosphere where doubt was dangerous and certainty deadly. What had begun as whispers of witchcraft in a single household had now become a colonial spectacle of judgment and death. And the machinery, once set in motion, showed no sign of stopping. The courtroom in Salem town was crowded, tense, and alive with spectacle. The accused stood at the front, facing a panel of stern judges, ministers seated nearby, and neighbours packed shoulder to shoulder in the galleries. Yet much of the evidence presented against them was not material. No bloody dagger was produced, no hidden poisons, no forbidden books. Instead, the decisive proof came from visions, dreams, and the cries of the afflicted. Spectral evidence, the claim that a person's spirit or spectre had appeared to torment the victims, became the weapon that cut through doubt and condemned the accused. In practice, this meant that the afflicted girls became the most powerful witnesses in every trial. When they screamed that they saw the spectre of a woman choking them, the judges leaned forward. When they fell into fits, clawing at their throats, the court believed it was the accused's spirit attacking them in that very moment. The physical body of the accused could stand silently before the bench, but the invisible spectre was treated as a separate, guilty presence. This blurred distinction between the seen and unseen created a reality in which denial only seemed to prove guilt. Ministers and judges justified this reliance on theology. For decades, Puritan writers had argued that Satan could not take the form of an innocent without permission. If someone's spectre was seen afflicting another, then the person must have entered into a pact with the devil. This belief gave weight to visions that, in a modern court, would be dismissed as imagination or deceit. But in 1692, they were treated as direct evidence of cosmic warfare. The afflicted themselves performed with dramatic consistency. During examinations, they would mimic the accused's gestures, claiming that invisible forces compelled them. If the accused clenched a fist, the girls might scream that they felt themselves strangled. If the accused shifted their weight, the girls might collapse as though pushed. To onlookers, these mirrored actions appeared too precise to be coincidence. The courtroom became theatre, and each fit, each cry, each accusation reinforced the belief that witches were actively at work in Salem. This reliance on the invisible created a nearly impossible situation for the accused. How could one defend against charges of sending out a spirit? No physical counter-evidence could disprove the claim. Testimony from neighbours about years of good character was easily dismissed in the face of a girl writhing on the floor, screaming that the accused spectre was tearing her flesh. Logic had little weight against spectacle. In this environment, innocence became irrelevant. What mattered was the interpretation of unseen forces. Spectral evidence also expanded the scope of the crisis. Because spirits were believed to travel, the afflicted could claim torment from people miles away. A villager in Salem could be accused of appearing in the dreams of someone in Ipswich or Andover. The web of suspicion widened rapidly, drawing in dozens who might otherwise have remained untouched. The invisible nature of the crime meant there was no natural boundary to the accusations. Anyone could be implicated, regardless of where they lived or how little contact they had with the afflicted. The court treated spectral testimony with deadly seriousness. Magistrates recorded every detail of visions described by the girls, shadowy figures, books of the devil signed in blood, animals that transformed into neighbors, phantoms that whispered temptations. Each story was woven into the record as evidence. And when combined with the confessions of those who broke under pressure, the case for a vast satanic conspiracy seemed undeniable. Not all were convinced. Some ministers, including Increase Mather, warned against the dangers of relying solely on spectral evidence. He argued that the devil could deceive, that Satan might assume the form of the innocent to destroy the righteous. But these warnings carried little weight in the fevered atmosphere of Salem. For the judges of the court of Oyer and Termina, for the villagers desperate to root out hidden evil, the afflicted girl's testimony was too immediate, too vivid to ignore. Their screams and visions carried more force than any sermon of caution. The consequences were devastating. Neighbors who had lived side by side for years found themselves torn apart by accusations that no rational defense could answer. A woman's refusal to confess made her look hardened to the devil. A man's stumbling prayer became proof that his spirit served Satan. Each case added fuel to the fire, convincing the community that they were uncovering a monstrous network of witches rather than destroying innocent lives. By elevating the invisible to the level of unquestioned proof, the court ensured that the trials would not be brief. Every fit was evidence, every vision testimony, every denial a deeper sign of guilt. The reliance on spectral evidence transformed suspicion into certainty and fear into legal judgment. It gave the afflicted children immense power, the judges unshakable confidence, and the community a sense that justice was being done, even as neighbors were led to the gallows. As the court convened week after week, it became clear that the accused faced an impossible choice. To deny witchcraft was to stand against the tidal wave of spectral evidence, the fits of the afflicted, and the stern questions of the judges. Denial led almost inevitably to conviction and the hangman's noose. Confession, however, offered a way out. Those who admitted to witchcraft often escaped execution, their lives spared on the condition that they name others. This dynamic created a grim paradox. Guilt became the path to survival, while innocence led to death. The first confessions shocked the community, but they also confirmed what many already believed. If the accused themselves admitted to consorting with the devil, then surely the danger was real. When Tituba told her story of witches' meetings and the devil's book, it planted the idea of a hidden conspiracy. Each new confession added detail, expanding the supposed network of witches and weaving new names into the narrative. To the judges, the consistency of these stories was proof of their truth. To the villagers, it was a revelation that their community was under siege by forces far greater than they had imagined. confession carried its own kind of performance. Those who broke under questioning often described meetings where witches flew through the night, where they gathered in fields or houses, where the devil appeared in various forms to demand their allegiance. They spoke of signing his book, of renouncing baptism, of receiving familiars in the form of cats, birds, or dogs. These details matched what the afflicted had claimed in their visions, creating a feedback loop where confession and accusation reinforced one another. The court recorded these accounts meticulously, weaving them into the growing story of a satanic plot. The more people confessed, the more names were added to the list of suspects. Fear spread outward in widening circles, touching families who had once felt secure. A servant might confess and implicate their master. A neighbour under pressure might name those with whom they had quarrelled. Old grievances were given new power, cloaked in the language of diabolical conspiracy. In a community already divided by land disputes, church conflicts, and rivalries, confession became a weapon as much as a survival tactic. Those who confessed were not always spared punishment, but they were spared immediate death. Their testimonies were used to convict others, and their cooperation was seen as evidence of repentance. This created a perverse incentive for the accused to implicate as many others as possible. The result was a snowball effect that expanded the circle of accusations far beyond Salem village. Soon, people in neighbouring towns, Andover, Ipswich, Topsfield, found themselves swept into the crisis. Jails across Massachusetts filled with the accused, from teenagers to elderly men and women, all trapped in the same impossible dilemma. The social consequences were devastating. Families were torn apart when one member confessed and named others, leaving those accused to protest their innocence in vain. Communities fractured as neighbours turned on neighbours. Fear became so pervasive that even silence was suspicious. To remain quiet under questioning suggested stubbornness, perhaps evidence of a hardened pact with the devil. To speak too freely risked naming others and perpetuating the spiral. Children, too, were drawn into the confessions. Some young people, faced with the sight of their parents in chains, admitted to witchcraft themselves in hopes of saving their families. Their words carried weight, adding to the sense that the devil's influence reached into every household. Ministers preached that no one was too young to be corrupted, that vigilance was required even within the walls of the home. As the summer of 1692 wore on, the number of accusations grew staggering. By August, dozens had been imprisoned, and more than a dozen had already been executed. Each hanging convinced many that the court was succeeding in its mission, that the community was purging itself of hidden evil. Yet the executions also heightened fear. If witches had infiltrated so deeply, who could say how many more remained hidden? The logic of confession and accusation ensured that the process could not easily stop. Each name produced another, each story another suspect, until it seemed the entire colony might be entangled in Satan's net. The snowball rolled forward with relentless momentum. What had begun with 3 women accused in March had grown into a crisis that engulfed villages across Massachusetts. The court of Oyer and Terminer, relying on confessions and spectral evidence, continued to validate the process. Ministers urged the people to stand firm against Satan, and the afflicted children, with every fit and every vision, drove the panic onward. By the time autumn approached, Salem was no longer just a community in turmoil. It was a colony consumed by hysteria, its jails overflowing, its gallows busy, its people divided by suspicion and fear. The confessions that had once seemed to offer a path to mercy had instead fueled a storm that showed no sign of breaking. And as the trials continued, the tragedy deepened, drawing in victims whose names would become forever tied to the darkest chapter of New England's history. When the first gallows was erected in Salem, it was not yet clear how far the trials would go. Bridget Bishop's execution in June had shocked the colony, but for many it had also seemed a grim necessity. The removal of a woman whose lifestyle and quarrelsome nature marked her as an obvious target. Yet her death opened the way for more. Once a rope had tightened around a neck on Gallows Hill, the boundary was crossed. Executions became not just possible, but expected, and Salem's path toward bloodshed was set. The place chosen for the hangings was a rocky rise just outside Salem town, later remembered as Gallows Hill. Spectators gathered there on days of execution, some out of fear, others out of grim fascination, still others convinced that they were witnessing justice. The condemned were led in chains, guarded by sheriffs, and watched closely by ministers. Each prisoner had been tried and found guilty by the court of Oyer and Terminer, their guilt established by the spectral fits of children, the confessions of others, or their own refusal to confess. To the authorities, the hangings were both punishment and warning, a declaration that witchcraft would not be tolerated. On July 19, 1692, 5 women were executed together. Among them was Sarah Good, the beggar whose sharp tongue and ragged life had made her an easy target. As she stood on the gallows, she maintained her innocence to the end. Tradition holds that when Reverend Nicholas Noyes urged her to confess, she spat back a curse. "I am no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." Her defiance lingered long after her death, her words remembered as a final challenge to the justice that killed her. With her died Rebecca Nurse, a 71-year-old grandmother known for her piety and respectability. Her conviction shocked many, for she had long been admired as a model of Christian virtue. Yet even she was not safe once the afflicted girls claimed her spectre tormented them. Neighbors who might have defended her remained silent, afraid of drawing suspicion on themselves. Her execution revealed that no one, not even the most respected matron, was beyond reach. Elizabeth Howe, Susanna Martin, and Sarah Wilds were hanged alongside them, each maintaining innocence, each condemned by visions and accusations. The crowd watched as their bodies swung from the gallows, a grim tableau of the colony's determination to root out witches. To those who believed the court's judgments, it was a day of triumph against Satan. To others, silent but uneasy, it was the beginning of doubt. The hangings continued in August, when 5 more were executed, including George Burroughs, a former minister of Salem Village. His case was particularly striking. The afflicted accused him of being the ringleader of the witches, the man who had led their meetings and orchestrated their pact with the devil. In court, he was portrayed as a sinister figure whose eloquence and strength masked dark allegiance. On the gallows, however, he astonished the crowd by reciting the Lord's Prayer perfectly, a feat believed impossible for a witch. For a moment, murmurs of doubt rippled through the spectators. Could the court have erred? But the authorities pressed forward, and the execution went on. His body was cut down and buried in a shallow grave near the hill, denied a proper burial. On September 19th came a death unlike the others. Giles Corey, an elderly farmer, had refused to enter a plea when accused of witchcraft. According to law, without a plea, the court could not proceed with a trial. To force his compliance, he was subjected to peine forte et dure, pressing with heavy stones. Day after day he lay beneath boards, more weight added until his chest cracked and his body strained against the crushing load. His only recorded words were, "More weight." He died without confession, without conviction, and without plea. His death a grim symbol of defiance in the face of injustice. 2 days later, 8 more were hanged at Gallows Hill, including Martha Corey, Giles's wife. She had been outspoken against the trials from the beginning, skeptical of the girl's fits and bold in her criticism of the court. Her execution silenced one of the trial's fiercest critics. Alongside her died Mary Easty, sister of Rebecca Nurse, who had written a dignified petition warning the court against shedding innocent blood. Her words had been ignored and her life taken. By September's end, 19 people had been hanged and 1 crushed to death. Dozens more languished in jail, awaiting trial. The gallows had become a regular feature of Salem's life, a grim reminder that the court's work was ongoing and that anyone could be next. Each execution deepened fear, for if so many could be found guilty, surely the conspiracy was vast. Yet each death also planted seeds of unease. The sight of elderly matrons, respected ministers, and stubborn farmers dying alongside beggars and outcasts forced some to wonder whether justice had been replaced by hysteria. Still, the executions did not end immediately. The machinery of accusation, confession, and trial continued, and the court pressed on. Gallows Hill bore witness to Salem's darkest season, its rocky ground soaked not with blood, but with the weight of fear, division, and death. The hangings, intended as acts of purification, instead marked the colony with a stain that could not easily be washed away. Giles Corey was not a man easily overlooked. By 1692, he was more than 80 years old, a farmer with a reputation for stubbornness, blunt speech, and a temper that had earned him enemies over the years. He had quarrelled with neighbours, faced fines in court for disputes, and carried the kind of reputation that made him an easy target once the wave of accusations began. Yet his fate would stand apart from all others, not because he confessed or was hanged, but because he refused to play the game at all. When accusations reached Corey, he did not react with the desperation of others. He was charged with witchcraft in April, following the testimony of the afflicted who claimed to see his spectre tormenting them. His wife, Martha Corey, had already been accused and imprisoned after voicing skepticism about the trials, and her boldness had only sharpened suspicion against their household. For the magistrates, Giles's quarrelsome nature and Martha's open defiance made them ripe for inclusion in the growing conspiracy. But when the time came to enter a plea, guilty or not guilty, Giles Corey refused. His silence was not an accident or a sign of confusion. It was a deliberate act of resistance. Under English law, a trial could not proceed without a plea. To enter a plea of not guilty meant subjecting himself to the court's machinery, to the spectral evidence and the afflicted girl's cries, to the near certainty of conviction. To enter a plea of guilty meant confessing to a crime he denied and implicating others. Refusal was the only path left, and Corey took it, knowing well the consequences. The penalty for refusal was peine forte et dure, the pressing of the body with heavy stones. It was a punishment rarely used in New England, but it was enshrined in English law as a way to force compliance. By refusing to plead, Corey could not be tried, and without conviction, his land could not legally be seized by the colony. In this way, his silence protected his estate, ensuring it would pass to his children and not be confiscated. Whether driven by defiance, strategy, or both, Corey's choice became the most extraordinary act of resistance in Salem's ordeal. The pressing began on September 17, 1692. Corey was taken to a field near the jail, stripped and laid on the ground. boards were placed upon his chest and heavy stones laid upon the boards. Witnesses described the slow, brutal procedure. Sheriff George Corwin, known for his harshness, directed the punishment, ordering more weight to be added when Corey refused to yield. Day by day, the stones piled higher, his chest straining under the crushing burden. Each time he was urged to enter a plea, Corey remained silent, except for 2 words that became his legend: more weight. The agony of pressing was unimaginable. The stones pressed the body until breathing became nearly impossible, ribs cracking, flesh bruising, blood seeping into the soil. The punishment was not meant to kill quickly, but to break the spirit. Yet Corey never relented. He refused to confess, refused to accuse others, refused even to acknowledge the authority of the court. After 2 days of torture, he died on September 19th, his body broken, but his silence unbroken. His death shocked Salem. For some, it was a sign of his guilt, proof that he preferred torment to speaking the truth. For others, it was a disturbing spectacle, a level of cruelty that exceeded anything the trials had yet produced. The fact that he died without conviction meant that his estate passed to his heirs, fulfilling his apparent intent. His wife Martha, however, would not be spared. She was hanged just days later, condemned despite her piety and protests of innocence. Giles Corey's story endured long after the gallows were dismantled. His stubborn refusal became a symbol of resistance against injustice. Legends grew around him, some claiming that his ghost haunted Salem, a curse upon Sheriff Corwin and upon the town itself. Folklore held that every sheriff of Essex County would suffer misfortune until the office moved out of Salem, a belief fueled by later tales of sudden deaths among Corwin's successors. Whether legend or truth, Corey's defiance left a mark deeper than the stones that crushed his chest. In the broader story of the witch trials, his death stands as a turning point. It revealed the lengths to which the authorities would go to enforce compliance, and it exposed the cruelty that lay at the heart of the proceedings. Pressing was not the act of a community purging itself of witches. It was the act of a government determined to break a man who refused to play its game. In his silence, Corey told the world more than any words could have, that the trials were unjust, that confession was coerced, and that resistance, even unto death, was possible. The gallows claimed 19 lives, but Giles Corey's death was singular. Where others were silenced by rope, he silenced his judges with refusal. Where others gave in to pressure, he demanded more weight. His story, brutal and unyielding, became one of the most enduring legacies of Salem, a reminder that even in the grip of hysteria, one man's defiance could stand against the tide. The Salem witch trials were not carried forward by the afflicted children alone, nor by the villagers who whispered suspicions about their neighbors. At the heart of the machinery were men who believed themselves guardians of both law and faith. The ministers who preached from pulpits, the judges who presided from benches, and the colonial leaders who sought order in the midst of chaos shaped the trials into what they became. Their authority, their choices, and their doubts determined the course of events, and the story of Salem cannot be told without seeing how their hands steered it. The ministers of New England lived under constant tension. They were spiritual shepherds in a society that believed itself chosen by God, but always at risk of divine punishment. Their sermons were filled with warnings about sin, about Satan's relentless assault on the faithful, about the need for vigilance. They spoke of the covenant binding the community to God, of the disasters that would follow if that covenant was broken. In times of uncertainty, Crop failures, epidemics, wars. The people looked to their ministers for explanations, and those explanations often pointed to the devil's hand. In Salem, the afflicted children seemed to provide visible proof of what the ministers had been preaching for decades. Samuel Parris, minister of Salem Village, was among the most zealous. His sermons thundered against hidden sins and satanic snares. From the pulpit, he warned that the devil walked among them, that the faithful must be watchful, that any crack in the community's discipline could be exploited by their enemy. His own household was at the center of the crisis. His daughter and niece the first afflicted, his enslaved woman Tituba the first to confess. To Parris, these events vindicated his warnings. When his congregation saw the children's fits, they did not question the theology that framed them. They heard in their screams an echo of their ministers' sermons. Parris's authority reinforced the belief that Salem Village was truly under siege. Other ministers lent their voices as the crisis deepened. Cotton Mather, already famous for his writings on providence and the invisible world, saw in Salem confirmation of his teachings. He had written about possession and witchcraft before, arguing that Satan sought to undermine New England's holy mission. Though he later urged caution in relying too heavily on spectral evidence, his early involvement gave intellectual weight to the trials. His father, Increase Mather, one of the most respected figures in the colony, likewise expressed concern, but did not openly oppose the proceedings until they had already claimed many lives. Their voices, so influential in shaping Puritan thought, carried enormous weight. Even when they spoke of restraint, they did so within the framework that witches and the devil were real, which meant the trial's foundation remained unshaken. The judges of the court of Oyer and Terminer embodied the union of law and religion. Chief Justice William Stoughton was the most committed of them, a man of rigid piety and iron certainty. He believed absolutely in the reality of witchcraft and in the righteousness of the court's mission. Under his leadership, the court admitted spectral evidence, accepted confessions extracted under pressure, and pushed forward with executions. Stoughton saw himself not as presiding over ordinary trials, but as waging spiritual war. To doubt the evidence was, in his mind, to risk leaving Satan's agents free to destroy the colony. Others on the bench shared his convictions, though not always with equal fervor. Some judges wavered, uneasy with the reliance on invisible proof, troubled by the sheer number of accusations, aware that respectable members of society were being condemned alongside beggars and outcasts. Yet few spoke openly against the proceedings while they were underway. The pressure to conform was immense. To question the evidence was to question the afflicted girls, the ministers, and the very structure of Puritan belief. It was to risk being seen as soft on witchcraft, perhaps even as a sympathizer with the devil's cause. The ministers and judges reinforced each other in a feedback loop that gave the trials momentum. The afflicted girls provided the spectacle. The villagers carried the rumors, but it was the authority of ministers' sermons and the judges' rulings that transformed fear into law. A girl's cry of torment became evidence because a minister said the devil sought to corrupt the innocent, and a judge ruled that the spectre she saw was real. Without that authority, the accusations might have remained gossip. With it, they became convictions and executions. Yet even within this machinery, doubt began to creep. The execution of George Burroughs, the former minister who recited the Lord's Prayer flawlessly at the gallows, disturbed many. If a supposed witch could speak the prayer with such clarity, what did that mean for the court's evidence? Ministers had long taught that witches could not utter those sacred words. When Burroughs did, Some spectators wept, others murmured dissent, and the seeds of unease were sown. Still, the execution went forward, the court unwilling to admit error, the ministers urging the people to trust that God's justice was being served even if appearances were troubling. Increase Mather's famous warning that it were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned would later become a rallying cry against the trials. But he did not issue it until October, after months of hangings and the death of Giles Corey under pressing. By then, the damage was done. His words reflected a shift in the colony's mood, an acknowledgement that doubt could no longer be suppressed. But in the critical months when the court needed restraint most, his caution had been muted, his influence unable or unwilling to stem the tide. The political leaders of Massachusetts also shaped the trials through their silence or complicity. Governor Phipps, who had authorized the court, was more concerned with military campaigns against the French and their indigenous allies than with the finer points of justice in Salem. His absence from the colony for much of the summer left Stoughton and the judges free to operate unchecked. When he returned in the fall and saw the extent of the crisis, he eventually intervened to dissolve the court. But like Increase Mather, his action came too late for those already hanged. The role of doubt in Salem's story is crucial. For months, the machinery of accusation and conviction rolled forward with little resistance because the authority of ministers and judges was nearly absolute. Ordinary villagers may have whispered concerns, may have wondered privately whether the afflicted were exaggerating or lying, but they lacked the power to stop the process. Ministers thundered from pulpits, judges handed down sentences, and the gallows claimed victim after victim. Only when doubt reached the highest levels, when ministers like Increase Mather spoke openly, when Governor Phipps finally acted, did the process begin to collapse. But the doubts were not purely intellectual. They were also emotional, born from the sight of respected, pious, and elderly members of the community led to execution. Rebecca Nurse, George Burroughs, Martha Corey. These were not fringe figures. Their deaths forced many to confront the possibility that the court had gone astray. Ministers had always taught that the devil was a deceiver, capable of masquerading as light. Could it be that in Salem, Satan's deception had twisted justice itself, turning the colony's leaders into instruments of hysteria? Such questions whispered through the villages, even as the court continued its grim work. The tension between conviction and doubt defined the final months of the trials. Ministers and judges alike clung to the belief that they were defending God's covenant, even as cracks appeared in their confidence. Some began to restrict the use of spectral evidence, acknowledging that it could be unreliable. Others urged prayer and fasting, hoping for divine guidance to resolve the crisis. But every step toward doubt came only after lives had already been taken, after the machinery had claimed its victims. The Salem witch trials were not the product of villagers alone, but of a system sustained by authority. Ministers framed the crisis in theological terms. Judges enforced that theology as law. And only when their doubts overcame their certainties did the trials begin to falter. Their choices, driven by faith, fear, and a desperate need for control, shaped the course of events more than any single accusation, and their hesitation to question sooner ensured that the tragedy reached the scale it did. As autumn deepened and the executions continued, the unease grew too strong to ignore. Ministers who had once supported the proceedings began to pull back. Judges who had once condemned without hesitation began to waver. The colony that had once believed it was purging itself of witches began to suspect it was shedding innocent blood. Doubt, long suppressed, finally found its voice, and with it, the machinery of Salem began to slow, though not before leaving scars that would endure for generations. By the autumn of 1692, the witch trials of Salem had reached their peak, but the very intensity that had fueled them also planted the seeds of their unraveling. For months, the court had functioned with an air of absolute certainty, sending 19 people to the gallows, pressing one to death under stones, and leaving scores to rot in jail awaiting trial. Each new confession had expanded the web of suspicion. Each execution had been framed as a victory against Satan. Yet as the leaves turned and the cold crept back into Massachusetts, the mood began to shift. Doubt, long whispered at the edges, forced its way into the open, and the machinery of accusation that had seemed unstoppable began to falter. One of the first cracks appeared in August, during the execution of George Burroughs. He had once been minister of Salem Village, a man of learning and strength. The afflicted claimed he was the leader of the witches, a dark figure orchestrating the devil's conspiracy. But on the gallows, Burroughs did something no accused witch was supposed to be able to do. He recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly, without stumbling. For years, ministers had preached that no servant of Satan could utter those sacred words. When Burroughs spoke them clearly, even with the noose around his neck, the crowd gasped. Some wept openly. Whispers spread that perhaps the court had condemned an innocent man. Yet the execution went forward anyway. To those who doubted, the event was unforgettable, and it planted a seed that would not die. The execution of respected figures like Rebecca Nurse, Martha Corey, and Mary Easty further deepened unease. These were not outcasts or beggars, but women known for their piety, kindness, and devotion. Their deaths shocked neighbours who had long admired them, forcing the question of whether the court could truly distinguish the guilty from the innocent. Easty herself had written a petition before her death, pleading for the court to stop shedding innocent blood. Her words, dignified and deliberate, circulated among the people and haunted them as more executions followed. By September, the sheer scale of the accusations strained belief. Dozens filled the jails. Entire families were entangled, with parents, children, and servants all accused. The afflicted girls named so many witches that the supposed conspiracy began to encompass nearly every corner of the colony. If so many were guilty, what did that say about the covenant community? Could God's chosen people truly be so riddled with Satan's agents? The logic of the trials began to collapse under its own weight. The death of Giles Corey added another disturbing note. His refusal to plead and the brutal pressing that killed him shocked the colony. Unlike the hangings, which had at least the appearance of judicial order, Corey's death was raw torture carried out in a field. His silence in the face of crushing stones became legendary, a grim act of resistance that highlighted the cruelty of the process. Many who had accepted the hangings as grim necessity were unsettled by the image of an old man, slowly crushed for refusing to speak. By October, the tide of doubt grew too strong to ignore. Prominent ministers, who had previously supported or remained cautious, began to distance themselves from the trials. Increase Mather, president of Harvard College and one of the most respected voices in New England, delivered a pointed warning. It was better for 10 witches to escape than for one innocent person to be condemned. His words struck at the very foundation of the court's work. If even the Mathers, pillars of Puritan authority, questioned the proceedings, how could the people continue to trust them? Governor William Phips, too, could no longer remain aloof. Preoccupied for much of the summer with military campaigns, he returned to a colony shaken by executions and overwhelmed by accusations. He saw that the jails were overflowing, that prominent citizens were uneasy, that the legitimacy of his government itself was threatened. Phips had authorized the court of Oyer and Terminer in May, but by October he ordered its dissolution. In its place, a new court was formed, one that was instructed to be more cautious and that soon rejected the use of spectral evidence. The immediate effect was dramatic. Without spectral testimony, the afflicted girls' fits lost much of their legal power. Cases that had seemed airtight unraveled. Accusations that once led directly to conviction now met with hesitation. Some prisoners were acquitted. Others languished in jail until they could be released. The machinery that had once condemned so many slowed and then ground to a halt. But the collapse was not clean. Those already executed could not be restored. The families of the dead were left with grief and stigma, their loved ones' names blackened as witches. Those still in jail often remained there for months, unable to pay fees for their release or facing reluctance from neighbors still suspicious. Even after the trials ended, the scars remained raw. The collapse of the trials did not mean the end of belief in witches. The Puritans did not suddenly abandon the idea that Satan was real or that he could act through human agents. What changed was confidence in the court's ability to identify those agents. Too many respectable figures had died, too much blood had been shed, and too much doubt had surfaced for the process to continue. Salem's tragedy had shown the dangers of relying on invisible evidence, the perils of letting fear govern justice, and the destructive power of unchecked authority. In the years that followed, many of those involved expressed regret. Jurors signed statements admitting that they had been misled. Judges confessed sorrow for their rulings. Ministers acknowledged that they had allowed fear to blind them. Governor Phips attempted to make amends by pardoning those still imprisoned and by offering compensation to the families of the dead. Yet none of these gestures could erase what had happened. The names of the condemned remained marked, their bodies buried in unmarked graves, their families left to carry the burden. The collapse of the trials marked not only the end of the executions, but also a turning point in New England's history. Never again would a witch panic of that scale grip the colonies. The lessons of Salem, bought at the price of 20 lives and the suffering of countless others, lingered in the collective memory. The ministers who had thundered about Satan's presence grew more cautious. The judges who had trusted spectral evidence became more skeptical. The people who had once cheered at executions remembered instead the sight of pious neighbors led to the gallows. Still, the collapse did not erase the atmosphere of fear that had given rise to the trials. The Puritans continued to live in a world where the devil was real, where misfortune could be read as divine judgment, where suspicion of the other lingered just below the surface. Salem was not the end of belief, but the end of a particular expression of it, a moment when fear and authority collided with devastating consequences. As winter returned in late 1692, Salem was a community transformed. The gallows no longer claimed victims, the court no longer listened to spectral visions, but the memory of what had happened could not be silenced. Families mourned, ministers preached caution, judges looked back with shame. The machinery of hysteria had collapsed, but its echoes would haunt New England for generations, a reminder of how fragile justice can be when fear and certainty take hold. When the executions ceased and the court of Oyer and Termina was dissolved, the colony might have hoped the nightmare would simply fade. But the trials did not end cleanly. They left behind a trail of broken families, ruined reputations, and a community forced to confront the enormity of what it had done. Salem, in late 1692, and the years that followed, was a village haunted, not just by ghosts in the imagination of its people, but by the heavy weight of guilt, grief, and silence. For those who had lost loved ones, the pain was immediate and unrelenting. Husbands returned to empty houses. Children grew up without mothers. Entire families carried the stigma of witchcraft, branded by their neighbors' accusations and by the gallows' final judgment. The bodies of the executed were denied proper burials in consecrated ground, cast instead into shallow, unmarked graves near Gallows Hill. Families sometimes crept under the cover of night to retrieve the corpses of their kin, giving them secret burials at home, away from the eyes of those who had condemned them. These acts of quiet defiance were born of desperation, a way to reclaim dignity for the dead, even as the community tried to erase them. The material costs were heavy as well. Those imprisoned had been forced to pay fees for their chains, their food, their confinement. Even those eventually released returned to homes stripped bare by debt. Farms fell into disrepair, animals lost, children scattered. Wives who had watched their husbands hang found themselves destitute, struggling to survive in a society that often shunned them. The stigma of accusation lingered long after the trials ended. To have been named as a witch, even if acquitted, was to carry a mark that could not be easily erased. The ministers and judges who had presided over the trials faced their own reckonings. Some offered apologies, though often couched in the language of error rather than sin. Samuel Sewall, one of the judges, stood publicly in Boston's South Church in January 1697 and confessed his guilt, asking for God's pardon for his role in the shedding of innocent blood. His act was rare and courageous, a public acknowledgement of responsibility in a culture where many clung to the belief that they had acted rightly at the time. William Stoughton, the Chief Justice, never expressed regret. He defended the court's actions until his death, convinced that doubt was a greater danger than error. His silence, in contrast to Sewall's repentance, revealed the divide between those who could face the trials as a tragedy of justice and those who saw them only as an unfortunate necessity. The ministers, too, wrestled with their roles. Increase Mather's words about preferring the escape of witches to the condemnation of innocents became a moral anchor in the years that followed. But his caution had come too late for the 20 dead. Cotton Mather defended his writings and involvement, insisting that he had urged caution even while supporting the reality of witchcraft. Many in the colony, however, blamed him for fueling the panic with his books and sermons. His reputation never fully recovered, and for centuries his name would be tied to the memory of Salem's tragedy. Samuel Parris, the minister whose household had been at the center of the storm, faced bitter resentment. His congregation fractured, many blaming him for his role in the accusations and his zealous defense of the court. By 1697, he was forced to resign, leaving Salem Village in disgrace. Governor Phipps, who had dissolved the court, sought to repair the colony's image. He pardoned many of those still imprisoned and attempted to restore a measure of order. But the damage to his administration was severe, and his reputation suffered as questions arose about why he had not intervened sooner. Salem had revealed the dangers of unchecked authority, and the governor's name was tied to the machinery he had created. The spiritual wounds were harder to heal. In 1697, the General Court of Massachusetts declared a day of fasting and repentance for the tragedy. Across the colony, ministers preached sermons of sorrow, urging the people to reflect on the sin of innocent blood. Families of the condemned attended, some finding comfort in the public acknowledgement of wrongdoing, others finding only bitterness that no true justice had been offered. The day was a step toward reconciliation, but it could not undo the trauma. For decades, petitions circulated seeking financial compensation for the families of those executed. Some restitution was granted in the early 1700s, though it was small and uneven. Rebecca Nurse's family, for instance, received compensation, while others struggled for years to have their names cleared. It was not until 1711 that the colony passed an act officially reversing the convictions of many of the accused and offering modest payments to their heirs. Even then, the process was incomplete. Not all names were cleared, and the stigma of accusation lingered in the collective memory. The aftermath was not only personal and political, but also cultural. Salem became a cautionary tale, invoked in sermons and writings as an example of the dangers of hysteria, false testimony, and reliance on invisible evidence. Ministers, who once thundered about Satan's snares, grew more cautious, wary of igniting another panic. The trials became a symbol of what could happen when fear overwhelmed reason, when authority bent to popular frenzy, when the invisible was treated as more real than the tangible. Yet within Salem itself, silence often prevailed. Families who had accused others lived alongside those whose kin had died. Neighbours passed one another on village paths, their glances heavy with memory. To speak too openly about the past was to risk reopening wounds, to admit guilt, or to relive grief. Many chose silence, leaving the scars unspoken but ever present. The village remained divided, its history etched into every field and meeting house. The afflicted children who had once convulsed in court grew into adults who had to live with the memory of what they had done. Ann Putnam Jr., one of the most vocal accusers, offered a public confession in 1706, standing before her church to admit that she had been misled by the devil and had wronged many innocent people. Her words carried weight, for she had accused more than 60 individuals, her testimony condemning some to death. In her confession, she sought forgiveness, but for many the damage could never be undone. Her act was rare, a glimpse of remorse from those who had helped fuel the hysteria, but it also revealed the long shadow of guilt carried by the very children whose fits had started the fire. The trials also reshaped the way New England viewed law and evidence. Spectral testimony, once accepted without question, became suspect. Courts grew more cautious, demanding tangible proof rather than visions or dreams. The memory of Salem lingered as a warning that the unseen could not serve as the basis for justice. In this way, the tragedy helped push the colony toward a more rational system of law, though the lessons had been learned at a terrible cost. Even generations later, the shadow of Salem remained. Families passed down stories of ancestors accused, executed, or spared. The names of the condemned were whispered in households, etched into church records, and carried as burdens through the years. Some families wore their connection as a mark of shame, others as a badge of endurance. The legacy of accusation lingered long after the gallows had been dismantled. In the collective memory of Massachusetts, Salem became a symbol of both sin and repentance, fear and endurance. The day of fasting, the public confessions, the petitions for restitution all marked attempts to come to terms with what had happened. Yet no act of repentance could fully erase the trauma. The village had killed its own, turned against neighbours, and silenced dissent with rope and stone. The shadows of 1692 lingered not just in the lives of survivors, but in the very identity of New England, a stain that sermons and apologies could never quite wash away. The aftermath of Salem was not the end of belief in witches or the devil, but it was the end of confidence in mass trials fueled by spectral evidence. The ministers continued to preach about Satan's power. The people continued to see misfortune as divine judgment. But never again would New England execute witches on such a scale. Salem stood as a warning, a scar that testified to the dangers of letting fear rule justice. Its shadows stretched far beyond the village itself, lingering in the memory of the colony and eventually in the history of a nation that would look back on Salem as both tragedy and lesson. When the executions ended and the confessions fell silent, Salem's wounds did not close. The people of Massachusetts carried their grief and guilt, but they also carried questions. How had it happened? How could neighbors, ministers, and judges be swept into a frenzy that condemned the innocent to death? In the years that followed, and then for centuries after, scholars, preachers, historians, and ordinary people offered explanations. Some looked to religion, others to politics, others to medicine and science. Each era projected its own concerns onto the events of 1692, weaving new theories about why Salem descended into hysteria. The search for answers became as much a part of the story as the trials themselves. For the Puritans of the late 17th century, the explanation remained religious. The devil was real, and he had truly sought to undermine the covenant community. Ministers framed the tragedy not as a mistake, but as a lesson in vigilance. Increase Mather's call to avoid condemning innocence was a warning about caution, not about abandoning belief in witchcraft. Cotton Mather continued to write about the invisible world, defending his involvement in the trials by claiming he had only urged moderation. For these men, Salem was not proof that witchcraft was false, but that Satan's deception was subtle. The devil had tricked even the faithful into misusing justice. To their congregations, the message was clear. The invisible war continued, and only prayer, piety, and obedience could guard against future snares. As time passed and the 18th century unfolded, the religious lens began to shift. The Enlightenment spread across the Atlantic, bringing with it new ideas about reason, science, and skepticism. In this atmosphere, Salem began to look less like a cosmic battle and more like an example of human folly. Writers in the 1700s began to frame the trials as evidence of the dangers of superstition, ignorance, and clerical power. To Enlightenment thinkers, Salem was not about Satan at all. It was about people blinded by fear and manipulated by religious zeal. The trials became a cautionary tale not about witchcraft, but about the misuse of belief itself. By the 19th century, historians and moral reformers used Salem as a mirror for their own causes. For some, the trial symbolized the dangers of unchecked authority, an example of what could happen when courts abandoned reason. For others, they illustrated the cruelty of religious fanaticism, a tool to argue for tolerance and separation of church and state. Salem's tragedy became part of the growing American narrative that warned against tyranny, whether political or spiritual. It was invoked in sermons, speeches, and essays as a lesson in liberty and justice. At the same time, writers and novelists drew upon the trials for drama. Nathaniel Hawthorne, whose ancestor John Hathorne had been one of Salem's judges, wrestled with the legacy in his works. His stories often explored themes of guilt, sin, and inherited shame, reflecting his personal struggle with the stain of Salem on his family's name. Through literature, the trials became not only a historical event, but also a symbol of the darker impulses within human communities. A story that could be retold to illuminate questions of morality and identity. In the 20th century, explanations turned increasingly towards psychology and social science. Scholars looked at the structure of Puritan society, its rigid hierarchies, its disputes over land, its fragile politics, and saw in Salem a community primed for conflict. Salem Village was divided between factions that supported Reverend Parris and those who opposed him, between families aligned with Salem town and those who resented its influence. The accusations often mapped neatly onto these divides, with the afflicted and their supporters targeting rivals. Historians argued that the trials were as much about politics and property as about religion. Witchcraft became a weapon in the hands of one faction against another, a way to settle old scores under the guise of piety. Others emphasized gender. The majority of those accused and executed were women, particularly women who defied the expected roles of wife, mother, and submissive Christian. Sarah Good was condemned for her sharp tongue and poverty. Sarah Osborne was punished for challenging inheritance laws and remarrying outside social norms. Bridget Bishop was targeted for her independence and unconventional lifestyle. Rebecca Nurse and Martha Corey were respected matrons, but their willingness to speak against authority drew suspicion. To feminist scholars, Salem reflected the fears of a patriarchal society facing women who stepped outside prescribed boundaries. Witchcraft accusations became a means of control, a way to silence and punish women who threatened social order. Medical explanations also gained traction. In 1976, a famous article suggested that the strange fits of the afflicted children might have been caused by ergot poisoning, a fungus that grows on rye and can produce hallucinations, convulsions, and paranoia. The theory captured the public imagination, offering a scientific explanation for behavior once attributed to Satan. Though later scholars criticized the idea, pointing out that ergot symptoms do not match the consistent patterns of the Salem fits, and that not all those afflicted ate rye bread from the same sources, the theory revealed a cultural shift. By the late 20th century, people wanted to understand Salem through biology and environment, not just through fear and politics. Psychological explanations went further. Some argued that the afflicted suffered from conversion disorder, expressing psychological stress through physical symptoms. The isolation of winter, the pressures of Puritan discipline, and the trauma of frontier wars may have triggered psychosomatic responses. Others suggested that the girls were not unconscious victims, but deliberate actors, using their fits to gain attention, power, and influence in a society where children, especially girls, had little voice. The courtroom gave them a stage, and the belief of adults gave their performances weight. In this view, the afflicted were neither deceived nor possessed, but opportunists who found themselves at the center of power. Sociological studies emphasized the broader context of colonial New England. The 1690s were a decade of instability. The colony had recently lost its original charter, creating political upheaval. King William's War raged on the frontier, sending refugees into Massachusetts with stories of violence and destruction. Fear of Native American raids haunted the colony. Economic pressures, disputes over land, and struggles for ministerial authority divided communities. Salem Village was already a cauldron of discontent before the first accusation was spoken. The trials became the spark that ignited existing tensions, turning private quarrels into public prosecutions. Each of these explanations, religious, political, gendered, medical, psychological, reflects not only the past, but also the concerns of the times in which they were made. In the Cold War era, Arthur Miller wrote The Crucible, using Salem as an allegory for McCarthyism, where accusations of communism mirrored the witch hunts of 1692. The play cemented Salem in American culture as a symbol of mass hysteria, of fear weaponized by authority, of the dangers of accusation without evidence. Through Miller, Salem's meaning stretched beyond New England, becoming a universal story about the fragility of justice under pressure. Today, scholars continue to debate Salem's causes. No single explanation satisfies every question. The trials were not the result of one factor, but of many converging at once. A deeply religious worldview that believed in the devil's presence, a divided community, a fragile political system, the pressures of war and uncertainty, and the psychological dynamics of children whose cries carry disproportionate weight. Salem's tragedy resists simplification because it was the product of human fear interacting with structures of authority, each feeding the other until reason collapsed. What remains constant across centuries is the human need to explain. Salem's horror demands answers, not only because of its victims, but because it reveals how ordinary people can become agents of extraordinary cruelty. Religion, politics, gender, medicine, psychology. Each lens reflects a search for meaning in events that seem senseless. The explanations change, but the question remains, how could it happen? And as each generation asks, it sees itself in the mirror of Salem. For the Puritans, it was Satan's deception. For the Enlightenment, it was superstition's folly. For reformers, it was fanaticism and tyranny. For modern scholars, it is social conflict, psychological stress, or poisoned rye. Salem endures not because it is solved, but because it is unsolvable. A tragedy that reveals the complexity of human communities under strain. When the hanging stopped and the court dissolved, Salem was left with silence, shame, and memory. But history does not remain still. Communities rebuild, wounds scar over, and stories shift in meaning as generations pass. The Salem of 1692 was a place divided, fearful, and scarred by executions. The Salem of today is something altogether different, a city where witches walk openly, where tourists flock to buy charms and tour haunted houses, where October is a month of parades, costumes, and celebration. The path from tragedy to tourism, from gallows to gift shops, is long and winding. It tells a story not only of Salem, but of how societies repurpose their darkest pasts into symbols, myths, and industries. For decades after the trials, Salem avoided the subject. Families who had lost relatives lived beside those who had accused them, and silence was often the only way forward. Ministers preached about sin and repentance, but few spoke directly about the names of the dead. The memory lingered like a wound everyone saw, but no one touched. The village itself eventually split, with Salem Village becoming the town of Danvers, leaving Salem Town to carry the broader legacy. Neither place seemed eager to preserve the story. To those who lived in the shadow of 1692, it was less a heritage to honor than a burden to forget. Yet memory cannot be erased so easily. Descendants remembered, records remained, and whispers endured. By the 18th century, writers in New England began to invoke Salem as a warning. Enlightenment thinkers used it as an example of superstition's dangers, of what happened when fear triumphed over reason. The name Salem slowly transformed from a local scar into a cultural symbol, a shorthand for hysteria and injustice. And as time passed, what had once been unspeakable began to attract attention. By the 19th century, Salem's past began to resurface in literature and popular imagination. Nathaniel Hawthorne, haunted by the legacy of his ancestor Judge John Hathorne, wove themes of guilt and sin into his stories, exploring the weight of inherited shame. His works did not retell the trials directly, but carried their shadow, presenting Salem as a place where the past pressed heavily upon the present. At the same time, historians began to publish more detailed accounts of the trials, framing them within the broader narrative of America's colonial past. Salem was no longer just a tragedy. It was a story that could be told, dissected, and debated. As America entered the 20th century, Salem's image began to change again. The city, struggling with the decline of shipping and industry, sought new ways to attract visitors. Tourism became a lifeline, and the witch trials provided a ready-made narrative. Sites associated with 1692 were preserved or reconstructed. Tours were offered. Souvenirs appeared. Salem discovered that its dark past could be its economic future. The gallows and the grief were reframed as heritage and history. The rise of mass culture accelerated this transformation. The 1950s brought Arthur Miller's play, The Crucible, which used Salem as an allegory for McCarthyism and the Red Scare. The play was a sensation, performed around the world, and it cemented Salem in global consciousness. Though Miller's Salem was a metaphor rather than a strict history, the association between witch hunts and the town of Salem became indelible. Tourists began to arrive not just out of historical interest, but because the trials had become a cultural touchstone, a story with resonance far beyond Massachusetts. Television and film soon joined in. In the 1960s, the popular show Bewitched filmed episodes in Salem, further linking the city with the image of witches. This time, however, the witches were not figures of fear, but of charm, humor, and fantasy. Salem leaned into the association, embracing the nickname Witch City. Local businesses adopted witch logos, souvenir shops sold charms and hats, and October festivals grew into annual traditions. What had once been shameful was rebranded as marketable. This transformation did not happen without tension. For many, especially descendants of the accused, the commercialization of Salem felt like a betrayal of history. The hangings had been real. The victims had been innocent. The grief of their families had been profound. To turn their suffering into costumes and souvenirs risked trivializing the tragedy. But others argued that Salem had found a way to survive, to turn a story of death into a story of resilience. The balance between remembrance and entertainment remains delicate, and Salem still wrestles with it every October as tourists flood its streets. The memorialization of the trials took more formal shape in the late 20th century. In 1992, the 300th anniversary of the trials, Salem dedicated a memorial near the old cemetery, with stone benches carved with the names of the executed. The simple design, quiet and solemn, stands as a counterweight to the carnival atmosphere of Witch City. It reminds visitors that beneath the costumes and parades lies a story of injustice and human suffering. The memorial represents Salem's attempt to honor the dead while still embracing the living economy of tourism. At the same time, Salem became a haven for modern witchcraft and neo-pagan traditions. Practitioners of Wicca and related paths found in the city both a symbolic home and a welcoming community. Witch shops, covens, and spiritual centers flourished, blending history, spirituality, and commerce. For them, Salem's embrace of the witch was not trivialization, but reclamation. Where the accused had once died for imagined pacts with Satan, Modern witches claim the name as identity, as empowerment, as resistance to the forces of conformity. The streets of Salem filled not only with tourists, but with real practitioners, turning Witch City into a living spiritual hub. This blending of tragedy, commerce, and spirituality makes Salem unique. Few other places in America have taken such a dark chapter of history and remade it into a cultural identity. The trials remain at the core, but around them swirl layers of meaning. A cautionary tale of hysteria, a tourist attraction of haunted houses and walking tours, a spiritual center for witches, a stage for Halloween festivals, and a site of solemn memorial. Salem contains them all, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in tension. Each October, the city becomes a spectacle. Parades march through the streets. Costumed visitors fill the sidewalks. Shops sell charms and hats. Psychics offer readings, and the memorial stones sit quietly, reminders of a past that cannot be erased. The juxtaposition is striking. A visitor might tour the site of the old jail in the morning, watch a witch-themed street performance in the afternoon, and stand in silence before the names of the dead in the evening. Salem has become a place where history, myth, commerce, and spirituality collide, layered one on top of the other. For some, this transformation is unsettling. The frivolity of Halloween celebrations seems to jar against the memory of hangings and pressing. The trials were not fantasy. They were mass hysteria that killed real people. To dance in witch hats where people once died feels like mockery. But for others, the transformation is a kind of triumph. Salem's history could have remained a wound, a source of shame. Instead, it has been embraced, reimagined, and turned into a source of identity and survival. Witch City thrives because it has learned to live with its ghosts, even if uneasily. Salem's transformation also reflects a broader cultural shift. Where the Puritans saw witches as threats to be destroyed, modern culture often sees them as symbols of independence, rebellion, and feminine power. The witch has been rebranded from enemy of God to icon of strength. Salem, in embracing the witch, has embraced this cultural reimagining. The city has moved from fear to fascination, from execution to empowerment. Yet beneath the costumes and commerce, the shadow of 1692 lingers. The memorial stones remain. The names of the dead are still spoken. The descendants still remember. The lessons of hysteria, of authority gone wrong, of justice undone, are still taught in classrooms and whispered on tours. Salem has not erased its past. It has layered it, reframed it, and woven it into an identity that is both haunted and alive. The journey from witch trials to Witch City is not one of forgetting, but of transformation. Salem has become many things: a warning, a carnival, a sanctuary, a brand. It is a place where tragedy and tourism meet, where memory and myth blur, where witches once died and now thrive. Its transformation reveals not only the resilience of a community, but the power of history to change shape, to adapt to new meanings, to live on in ways the people of 1692 could never have imagined. Centuries have passed since the nooses were cut down on Gallows Hill, since Giles Corey was crushed in the field, since children screamed in the meeting house and judges bowed their heads as if they were listening to the devil himself whisper in their ears. Yet Salem has never faded into the quiet of history. Other tragedies of the 17th century, wars, plagues, famines, have slipped into the background, remembered only by specialists. Salem, however, lingers. It returns in classrooms, in plays, in novels, in films, in October festivals, in the words witch hunt hurled across political debates. It refuses to die. The question is why? What makes Salem endure when so many other stories have grown cold with time? Part of the answer lies in the raw drama of the trials themselves. The story is filled with striking characters and unforgettable images. Children writhing in fits, a minister reciting the Lord's Prayer on the gallows, an old farmer demanding more weight as stones crushed his chest, women of piety and women of defiance standing side by side with ropes around their necks. The scenes of Salem have the vividness of theatre, and they read like tragedy, written for the stage. The human mind clings to stories that combine horror, injustice, and spectacle, and Salem offers all of them in abundance. It is a drama of neighbours turning on neighbours, of courts twisting truth, of ministers thundering from pulpits, of hysteria rising until it explodes. The sheer narrative power of Salem explains part of its endurance, but the story also endures because it speaks to universal fears. Salem was about witches, but it was never only about witches. It was about fear of the other, fear of hidden enemies, fear of unseen threats. Every generation faces its own version of those fears, whether it is communists in the Cold War, terrorists in the wake of attacks, or imagined conspiracies in moments of crisis. Salem provides a mirror, a way to see how fear can warp judgment, how suspicion can spread, how ordinary people can become executioners of their neighbours. To study Salem is to confront the possibility that under the right pressures, any community can fall prey to the same madness. The language of Salem has entered everyday speech. To call something a witch hunt is to accuse it of being unjust, driven by hysteria rather than evidence. Politicians, journalists, and activists invoke the phrase constantly, sometimes with little regard for historical accuracy, but always with an instinctive sense that Salem stands as the archetype of persecution without proof. The persistence of the phrase shows that Salem is not just history, but metaphor, a way of describing injustice that transcends time and place. The endurance of Salem also rests on the human fascination with witches themselves. Across cultures, witches embody both fear and fascination, figures of danger, rebellion, and power. The Puritans saw witches as Satan's allies, enemies to be destroyed. Modern culture often sees witches as symbols of independence, resistance, and feminine strength. Salem, as the site where real people died under accusations of witchcraft, becomes the ground where these shifting meanings play out. For tourists, witches are charming and entertaining. For neo-pagans and Wiccans, they are spiritual ancestors and inspirations. For feminists, they are symbols of women punished for stepping outside patriarchal boundaries. For historians, they are victims of hysteria and injustice. Salem endures because witches endure, constantly reinvented in the imagination. Another reason Salem haunts us is because it is a story of authority gone wrong. The trials were not mobs in the street, they were official courts, presided over by respected judges, guided by ministers, sanctioned by the governor. The machinery of law was turned against the innocent, and it was turned by the very people entrusted with justice. This is why Salem unsettles us still. It shows how institutions meant to protect can become instruments of persecution. It is easier to dismiss mob violence as chaos. It is harder to dismiss Salem, where the courtroom itself became a stage for hysteria. The lesson is chilling. Authority can fail, and when it does, the results are catastrophic. The trials also reveal the danger of evidence built on belief rather than fact. The court relied on spectral testimony, visions, dreams, fits invisible to anyone but the afflicted. To modern eyes, this seems absurd, yet at the time, it was accepted by respected men as proof. Salem endures because it asks us to confront how easily evidence can be twisted, how quickly standards can collapse under pressure, how what feels certain in the heat of fear can be exposed as folly in the calm of hindsight. Every society wrestles with questions of evidence and proof, and Salem stands as the ultimate warning of what happens when those questions are answered wrongly. The endurance of Salem is also cultural. The story has been retold endlessly, each retelling shaping how people see it. Arthur Miller's The Crucible framed it as an allegory for political persecution, ensuring that Salem would be remembered not just as colonial history, but as a symbol of modern dangers. Hawthorne wove its guilt into American literature. Films and television shows dressed its witches in cloaks and hats, reshaping tragedy into entertainment. Every retelling keeps the story alive, even as it changes meaning. Salem has been adopted into the cultural bloodstream, no longer just a place in Massachusetts, but an idea invoked whenever fear, persecution, or witches are mentioned. Yet Salem endures not only because of its metaphorical uses, but because of its humanity. The names of the dead, Rebecca Nurse, George Burroughs, Sarah Good, Martha Corey, Giles Corey, are not just characters in a story, but people who lived, worked, prayed, quarreled, and died. Their humanity refuses to be erased. The memorial stones in Salem, with their simple engravings of names and dates, remind visitors that these were not abstract lessons, but real lives taken unjustly. The endurance of Salem is the endurance of memory, the insistence that the victims be remembered and that their suffering not be forgotten. At the same time, Salem endures because it is unresolved. There is no final explanation, no single cause that satisfies every question. Was it religious zeal, political rivalry, personal grudges, psychological stress, poisoned grain? Each theory offers something, but none explains everything. The mystery remains, and mystery keeps stories alive. If Salem could be explained neatly, it might rest quietly in history books. But because it resists final answers, it continues to provoke debate, to invite new interpretations, to haunt us with the sense that we still do not fully understand how it happened. The city of Salem itself ensures that the story endures. By embracing the identity of which city, it has transformed the trials into living culture. Tourists who visit, whether for haunted houses or memorials, carry the story away with them. The festivals, shops, and tours may sometimes blur history into spectacle, but they also keep the memory alive. Salem's endurance is not just in books and classrooms, but in streets filled with costumed visitors each October, in the voices of tour guides, in the stones of the memorial where people leave flowers. The story endures because the place itself has chosen to embody it. Ultimately, Salem endures because it speaks to something deep in human nature. It is a story of fear and power, of innocence and accusation, of community and betrayal. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about ourselves. What would I have done? Would I have believed the afflicted? Would I have accused my neighbor? Would I have confessed to save my life? Would I have spoken out or remained silent? Salem endures because it is not only about them, but about us, about the choices any of us might make under pressure, about the fragility of justice and the persistence of fear. The trials are long over, the gallows long gone, the graves unmarked. Yet Salem remains with us, its spell unbroken. It haunts because it is tragedy. It haunts because it is metaphor. It haunts because it is unresolved. It haunts because it is human. And as long as fear and suspicion exist, as long as communities wrestle with questions of justice and authority, as long as witches fascinate and frighten, Salem will not fade. Its story will be told again and again in classrooms and theatres, in books and festivals, in whispers and warnings. Salem endures because it must, as its spell lies not in magic, but in memory, in the lesson it teaches and the questions it refuses to answer. And that is why, more than 3 centuries later, Salem still haunts us,